Buenos días a todos. Estoy muy alegre de estar aquí desde un país muy lejos de Colombia, pero con muchos intereses comunes, pienso yo. Lo siento porque deben de hablar o presentar en inglés, porque hablando en español demasiadas palabras me faltan. Entonces, discúlpame si voy a continuar en inglés. My task is to provide a picture of the process of economic integration in the Asia-Pacific region, and I will do this by trying to answer briefly the questions: where did we come from, where have we come from, where are we now, and where are we going, or I should say, where might we go in the future, because we have so many uncertainties, as the previous two speakers have been emphasising. So I'll begin with the decade of the 1990s, which is where we see the emergence of two of the principal actors in Asia-Pacific integration up until the present day. First of all, APEC, or APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, founded in 1989, expanding from 12 to 21 members by 1998. We can see here the expansion of APEC from the original members in 1989, China, Taiwan or Chinese Taipei and Hong Kong in 1991, Mexico and Papua New Guinea in 1993, Chile in 1994, and Russia, Vietnam and Peru in 1998. And at that point, the leaders of APEC decided on a moratorium on new members, which we can discuss perhaps if you wish later. But they have not changed that moratorium ever since 1997. So APEC is an expression of the Trans-Pacific approach to integration in the Asia-Pacific, which I'll explain why that's important in a minute. It also is a very unusual institution in that it operates entirely on the basis of voluntary, non-binding common commitments, where the approach was originally intended to be by peer pressure rather than legal enforcement, but it did establish some very ambitious goals or objectives for trade and investment. We call these the BOGOR goals, which envisaged the free trade and investment in the Asia-Pacific region by 2020. Obviously, much too optimistic. It also predicated its agenda on a very strong support for the multilateral trading system, the rules-based system based on in English, WTO, and Spanish, OMC. And initially, its idea was to proceed with liberalisation on the basis of concerted unilateralism, which means that the countries of the region would all liberalise together, but they would do so on a non-preferential basis. In other words, APEC has never intended to be a preferential trade bloc, and that's one of its distinguishing features. By the end of the decade, as we'll see, this idea of liberalisation, achieving free trade and investment by concerted unilateralism, had come to be seen as unrealistic, but that was the original idea behind APEC. And in terms of its global footprint, APEC in 2016 accounted for 60% of world GDP, 47% of world trade, and 39% of the world population. And of course, it includes amongst its members the three largest individual economies in the world, in the United States, China, and Japan. The other major actor that emerged into the region in the 90s was the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, which had been established back in 1967 by 5 Southeast Asian countries, primarily for political purposes, but in the 1990s it began to increase its economic integration efforts by, first of all, establishing the ASEAN Free Trade Area in 1992, and then has gradually continued to expand its efforts at regional integration among its members. In the decade of the 2000s, we saw the explosion of the spaghetti bowl, or the noodle bowl as it's called in Asia, of free trade agreements. which the previous speakers have both mentioned, I think. And this coincided with a loss of confidence in APEC's concerted unilateral approach, and also a loss of confidence in the WTO following the disastrous ministerial meeting in Seattle in 1999. And we saw also, very importantly, the emergence of two competing visions of integration. As well as the Trans-Pacific approach that embodied in APEC, we also see a very strong upsurge of support for East Asian regionalism, the idea of East Asia establishing itself as a separate economic region in the world, and this was a reaction to the East Asian economic crisis of 1997-1998. We see that in many of the free trade agreements negotiated at this time, and especially in the so-called ASEAN Plus agreements, which the Southeast Asian nations negotiated with China, with Japan, with Korea, with Australia and New Zealand, and also with India, and also in proposals during this period for free trade agreements covering the entire East Asian side of the Pacific. One called the East Asian Free Trade Agreement, based on the ASEAN Plus 3 group, ASEAN plus China, Japan, Korea, and the other, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership for East Asia, based on the ASEAN Plus 6 group, which also included Australia, New Zealand, and India. So this idea of East Asian regionalism, and based very strongly on ASEAN's claim to be the centre of this process, ASEAN centrality, as they call it, was a very strong feature in the 2000s. Trans-Pacific integration continued to be the objective for some of the countries in the region. We saw a proposal for the free trade area of the Asia Pacific, the FTAAP or FTAP, emerge as early as 2004, but it was very little supported at that time, and it had to gradually grow its support over the rest of the decade. There was the so-called P4 agreement among four very small Asia Pacific economies, which was established with the explicit idea of trying to keep the Trans-Pacific ideal alive against the sort of pressure from the East Asian regionalism idea. And in the background, of course, APEC continued as the region-wide forum with its voluntary non-binding modality, remaining committed to these Bogor goals and focusing now, instead of concerted unilateralism, on how the FTAs, the free trade agreements, could actually contribute to achieving the Bogor goals. 2010 was really a watershed year for the Asia Pacific because two important things happened here. First of all, the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations began, the TPP, which actually brought the Trans-Pacific approach to integration right to the fore. And secondly, the APEC leaders decided to give a boost to the idea of a free trade area of the Asia Pacific, the FTAP, by making a declaration on the pathways to the FTAP, which really crystallised the idea of the FTAP as the ultimate objective of Asia Pacific integration. So their declaration elevated the status of the FTAP from what had been seen as a very long-term prospect to what they called a major instrument to further APEC's regional integration agenda, and they also decided to give equal endorsement to the two kind of approaches within the Asia-Pacific region, to the ASEAN Plus 3 or ASEAN Plus 6 approach, the East Asian approach, and the TPP, the Trans-Pacific approach, as routes to the FTAP, essentially encouraging a two-track approach to creating the FTAP, a Trans-Pacific track, which would be the TPP, at that time already under negotiation, and the East Asian track, which at that point created a problem because there was no East Asian regional agreement under negotiation. Neither the ASEAN Plus 3 or the ASEAN Plus 6 had proceeded to the stage of negotiation. So one of the tasks for the East Asian side was to create a viable track to serve as the pathway to the FTAP, and the ASEAN countries launched the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership for that purpose. The RCEP was launched essentially for that purpose, containing as its members the 10 countries of ASEAN and the plus 6 partners, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and India. And the idea was to consolidate the existing free trade agreements between ASEAN and those 6 countries the individual agreements, to consolidate those into a single agreement called the RCEP. The negotiations began in 2013. ASEAN insisted on being the leader of this process, even though we often talk about the RCEP as being China's agreement. ASEAN has always insisted that they lead the RCEP and that it is based around this idea of ASEAN centrality, which they have insisted on from the early 2000s. And of course, at the same time, parallel to this, we saw the establishment of the Pacific Alliance, which is the main subject of today's conference. So if you could describe the vision of the APEC leaders on how to create the FTAAP in 2010, in that simple diagram, the TPP and the RCEP leading into the free trade area of the Asia Pacific, a very neat picture of how East Asian integration could proceed. That slide shows the process of the two initiatives. TPP negotiations launched in 2010, gradually increasing the participating countries from 7 through to the 12 that concluded the agreement in 2015, and very importantly, Japan, Mexico and Canada came into it, which made it a much more important potential agreement in the terms of trade. The RCEP negotiations began in 2013. It's been a very slow process. We've had 21 negotiating rounds by the beginning of this year, and compared to the TPP, which has 30 chapters, which means it covers a very wide range of topics, of issues, the RCEP tends to focus on the, if you like, the bread and butter issues of goods, services, investment and intellectual property. The target date of 2015 was missed, and the target date has been successively extended to 2016, 2017, now 2018, and maybe in future 2019. I'll just say something briefly about the TPP, which is of course the basis of the CPTPP, which is now the agreement in play, because it is the one concluded agreement so far which has the status of being perhaps a model for future region-wide integration in the Asia-Pacific region. There's a lot of rhetoric around the TPP and CPTPP about how high the ambition is, a high standard 21st century comprehensive agreement, and that has raised a number of concerns around the region, that maybe it's too difficult, too demanding for many of the countries in the region, particularly developing countries in the region. But if we take a reality check and look at what the TPP actually agreed, we find that the negotiations actually reduced somewhat the rigour of the agreement and allowed a lot of flexibility and exceptions to deal with the sensitivities of individual participants, and in particular the problematic aspects of the US negotiating position. And there was concern that the US would force its own model onto the TPP, but the problematic aspects of the US position, many of those were negotiated out of the agreement as part of the negotiating process. And a number of the elements in the TPP are also not subject to dispute settlement. So again, they're not strictly legal enforceable. And finally, some of the most critical issues in today's international trade, for example, the issues relating to the digital economy and digital trade, cross-border data flows, privacy, data localization, and how those issues relate to each other, those issues have not been resolved in the TPP, as they haven't been resolved really anywhere else either. So you could conclude by saying the TPP is certainly not the last word in a trade agreement, but it is actually quite an advanced agreement, but it's definitely not the last word in trade agreements. If we look at the free FTAP, what happened with that? What's the state of play? Well, somewhat surprisingly, perhaps to many outside observers, China actually took the lead to promote the TPP when it hosted APEC in 2014, which gives a sort of insight onto what China was thinking at that time about where it would like to see the Asia-Pacific integration process leading. And China secured the agreement of the APEC leaders to announce a roadmap for APEC's contribution to the realisation of the FTAP. It included guiding principles that the agreement should be comprehensive, high quality, building on APEC's progress to the Bogor goals, building on existing regional architectures, especially the TPP and the RCEP, but it should be negotiated and realised outside APEC, parallel to the APEC process, In other words, APEC's non-negotiation, voluntary, non-binding character, its role as a forum for building consensus, dialogue on trade policy issues, that would continue. The FTAAP would be negotiated outside that. But APEC would be, through that role as a forum for dialogue, as a consensus building mechanism, would be the incubator for the FTAAP. The leaders commissioned a collective strategic study, which was jointly chaired by China and the US. You could not imagine that happening today, 2 years later, or 2 or 3 years later, but China and the United States chaired the collective strategic study on the FTAAP, not without quite a bit of difficulty, but they did it. And they presented the report to the APEC leaders in 2016, and it's interesting to note that in that report the Pacific Alliance is frequently mentioned as another potential pathway to the FTAAP. And the APEC leaders in 2017 and 2018 have actually committed themselves, perhaps surprisingly in 2016 and 17, committed themselves to a process that would aim at the realisation of the FTAAP. So on paper there is still a commitment there, but you have to question the likelihood of this being progressed to conclusion anytime soon, given the current situation, particularly between China and the United States. So at that point, talking about where we had come from and where we had got to, at that point you could describe the evolution of the Asian Pacific trade architecture relatively straightforwardly in that diagram. You could say that there's the FTAP, the blue circle embracing all of the APEC economies, the RCEP covering a large number of Asia-Pacific economies, but also some economies outside Asia-Pacific, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar and India, the TPP embracing a trans-Pacific group of countries with the United States there, but also a number of other important APEC members, and then you have the Pacific Alliance down on the bottom right-hand corner there as a potential further addition to the whole process of integration. So that, and behind all that, of course, we still have the noodle bowl. The spaghetti bowl is still there. Behind all that, none of the noodle bowl agreements have been cancelled yet. We don't know, never discussed really how the noodle bowl would be integrated with this more ambitious and more consolidated architecture. So that was where we were, should I say, at the end of 2016, but then we have the President Trump phenomenon and the emergence of the United States not as a builder of integration, but as a major disruptor, both in regional integration and also in the global trading system. So President Trump's actions in relation to regional economic integration, he of course withdrew from the TPP in February 2017, expressing a very strong preference for bilateral over plurilateral agreements, presumably because he believes that the United States could use its economic muscle in a bilateral negotiation much more effectively than in a plurilateral negotiation, and certainly the United States was pushed into withdrawing some of its more extreme positions in the TPP negotiations. He announced that the elimination of the United States bilateral trade deficits would be the fundamental objective of US trade policy, which of course is heavily criticised by almost every trade economist as a ridiculous objective. He launched the renegotiation of the Korea-US FTA and NAFTA to pursue that objective of eliminating bilateral trade deficits, and the Korean-US negotiation was actually completed earlier this year, and I think that's quite interesting because it may provide something of a model for how countries that are being attacked in this way may respond. What the Koreans seem to have done is to conclude an agreement which minimised the damage to themselves, essentially by accepting a voluntary export restraint on their steel and some other exports to the United States, but allowed the United States under President Trump to claim a huge symbolic victory, even though in economic terms I think it should be actually assessed as a loss for the United States. And we still have the NAFTA renegotiation supposedly nearing completion, but nobody really knows, I think, exactly what the form of that result is going to be, even though they are talking about concluding these negotiations within the next 2 weeks. And then at the 2017 APEC leaders meeting, President Trump repeatedly referred to the Indo-Pacific region, which is a completely unknown and unheard of concept within the Asia-Pacific context, while never once mentioning either APEC or the Asia-Pacific, and that led to a lot of head-scratching. What was he getting at there? What was the purpose of that? Because it did seem rather strange. Maybe he was trying to minimise the economic importance of East Asia in the global or regional economy, or maybe this was a thinly veiled reference to something called the Quadrilateral Security Partnership, which involves the US, India, Australia and Japan, which has to be interpreted as an initiative that would aim to limit the influence of China. So certainly President Trump has thrown what I guess the Americans would call a curveball, a very significant curveball into the process of Asia-Pacific integration. One of the big uncertainties is what will the United States actually do to follow up on this initial disruption that has been introduced. We really don't know. I mean, we do know, for example, though, that the formulation of the APEC leaders' declaration at the end of last year required 6 days and 6 nights of very intense negotiation among the representatives of the APEC economies, and there is a trade ministers meeting coming up next week where an equally difficult negotiation is expected to come up with some kind of common statement at the end of that meeting. And then we have the United States as a disruptor of global trade governance, perhaps even more important than its role in disrupting Asia-Pacific integration, the open support of the Trump administration for protectionism, the widespread and haphazard threats, some of which they've implemented, some not, of unilateral tariff impositions on many different partners. Some of these are dubiously justified as safeguards or under the national security exception, but some of them are clearly blatantly breaches of WTO obligations. His threat of trade wars with China in particular, but with other countries as well, with the European Union, and what seems to be a deliberate weakening of the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism. And we have to say there that actually started under the Obama administration. It wasn't something new that came with the Trump administration. So what is all this leading to? Well, I'd suggest we're looking at two possible outcomes here. Both of them are back to the future, but one is back to the future as the 1980s. The other one would be back to the future as the 1930s. The back to the 1980s future would be with the US pursuing a unilateralist trade policy as it did in the 1980s, relatively unconstrained by global trade rules and a weakened dispute settlement system, and maybe following the model of Korea in the Korea-US renegotiated FTA, widespread use of voluntary export restraints to limit the economic damage coming from the US trade policy. Voluntary export restraints basically limit the damage to the exporting country because they accept a lower volume of exports, but they also expect to achieve a higher price because of the reduced supply. The United States, probably something that President Trump and his administration would not like to emphasise, the United States in return accepts that their imports will cost more. So that's why I would say that these voluntary export restraints are essentially an economic loss for the United States. But the political imperatives of providing protection to various industries is achieved, and the loss is essentially borne by United States consumers and the United States community. So, and that in the 1980s, a large part of world trade was covered, 10 to 15% was covered by voluntary export restraints, and we may be heading back to that kind of scenario under the current trade policy stance of the Trump administration. And that may be quite difficult to avoid that kind of scenario because this is where the US trade policy seems to be heading. And essentially what it involves is putting aside to a large extent some of the most important achievements of the Uruguay round and the formation of the WTO. The much more pessimistic back to the future scenario is back to the 1930s, global trade without any rules and without any disciplines, and that would be the sort of nightmare scenario, I think, which we hope we can avoid, but that depends probably not so much on the United States because we can't control that, but it depends on how the rest of the world responds. And that brings me to say, well, what are the countries in the Asia-Pacific region doing about all this? Well, as has been already explained, the remaining 11 TPP members have signed the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. They were led by Japan. Japan was motivated primarily by a desire to avoid a bilateral free trade agreement with the United States, in which they might be pressed to liberalise their agricultural sector in a way which they had avoided in the TPP. And they were expecting that the CPTPP, combined with the Japan-European Union Free Trade Agreement, would inflict enough trade damage on the United States to create pressure among the US business and agricultural interests for President Trump to go back to the TPP. That was, I think, the Japan strategy. The text of the CPTPP is identical to the TPP, except for a small number of clauses that were suspended, and so it retains the balance that the TPP had achieved by resisting some of those more problematic US demands in the TPP negotiations. The economic value of the CPTPP obviously is diminished by the absence of the United States, although some of the economic simulations that have been done suggest that some countries will actually be better off without the United States in the agreement. The United States is not only a market, but it's also a formidable competitor for some of the TPP countries, and they benefit by not having the US entitled to the same trade preferences as the other members of the TPP. The RCEP, the leaders of the RCEP countries have pushed the negotiators to make every effort to complete that agreement this year. We'll wait and see. And then, of course, we also have China, which is now prioritising its so-called Belt and Road, or BRI initiative, which is a move to create economic partnerships across what they call the Maritime Silk Road, the blue line there, that's the road, and the Silk Road itself, the economic belt, stretching through Central Asia to Europe. The BRI is not a trade agreement. There is no formal trade agreement involved in the BRI. What it essentially is a initiative to build economic connections along the belt and the road by implementing large-scale infrastructure developments financed by the Asia Infrastructure and Development Bank, founded by China and other development banks. And again, APEC remains in the picture, perhaps more important than ever, in the sense that the enormous need there for more dialogue, consensus building, how to develop a common approach to the uncertainties and the challenges that we face in the Asia Pacific. So it's still there as a potentially valuable forum for dialogue and consensus building on trade policy issues. And in fact, APEC is concerning itself now with what should its agenda, what should its program be in the years beyond 2020, which is a sort of the termination of a number of its programs, like, for example, the Bogor Goals. So what can we expect in the future? Well, President Trump has sometimes indicated that he could be interested in returning to the TPP. He calls it the TPP, although that doesn't exist anymore. If he can get a better deal, by which he presumably means he would like to roll back some of the concessions that the United States had to make in the initial TPP, I suspect that that is very unlikely to get an agreement from the remaining 11 countries. I certainly don't think they should submit to that pressure. And I doubt whether that's going to happen. The CPTPP will enter into force later this year or early next year, and at that point it will be open to new members. And I can't see any obvious argument why, for example, Colombia should not join the CPTPP if it wished once that happens, and there are other possible new members being talked about, Korea, Thailand, and the big question is whether China would ever be interested in joining the CPTPP. That's a very open question. The FTAAP, which at one point looked as though it was a real prospect, now looks like a very distant possibility given the situation currently between the United States and China, because when you look at the FTAAP, one of the principal rationales for the FTAAP would have been to bring the United States and China together. Without that happening, then the FTAAP loses a lot of its economic rationale. And that brings me perhaps to my final point, that among all the uncertainties and difficulties and challenges, I think one thing we can say for certain in the Asia-Pacific region is that whatever does happen, it will be very heavily influenced by what happens to relations between the United States and China. So that is really going to be one of the major points for all countries in the region to watch and look for the implications for the region as a whole. Muchas gracias. Yeah, sure. If there are questions, I'd be very happy. If you wish, you could ask them very slowly in Spanish, or you can ask them in English. Yes. Probably, preferably in English, yes. Right.
Muchas gracias. En realidad, profesor Scoley, no es una pregunta, es algo que le quería contar a este auditorio, y que el profesor Scoley, movido por la virtud de la humildad, no dijo. Cuando surgió en la cumbre de APEC en Santiago en el 2004, la idea de un acuerdo amplio de libre comercio del Asia-Pacífico fue en el Consejo Empresarial de la APEC. Fue un miembro por Canadá, y la presidencia chilena de este Consejo Empresarial inmediatamente tomó la idea y la comenzó a promover. Y el primer estudio sobre la factibilidad se le encargó precisamente al profesor Scoley, él no lo mencionó. Y ese estudio, lo recuerdo muy bien, cuando nos lo mandó, dijo dos cosas muy importantes. La primera es que solamente un acuerdo multilateral a nivel OMC era superior a un acuerdo de la región Asia-Pacífico en términos de beneficios, o sea, de bienestar. Y el segundo punto es que en un acuerdo amplio de la región Asia-Pacífico no podía faltar ninguno de los actores principales, vale decir Estados Unidos, Japón, Corea, China.
Okay.
Quería contarles esto.
Okay, la respuesta en inglés, por favor. Okay, so the question was, is a multilateral agreement at the level of the OMC preferable to an agreement among the Asia-Pacific countries like the FTAAP? And the answer in principle, of course, is yes. If an agreement at the multilateral level could be achieved, then certainly that would be the sort of ideal. But we have to remember that one difference between agreements at the level of the OMC is that if they're achieved, they result in some reduction in tariffs, and reduction actually in bound tariffs rather than the applied tariffs. So you sort of can foresee, if the OMC can continue to operate successfully, little by little, a reduction in world trade. That is actually very important. It's very important to maintain that level of trade barrier reduction at the global level on a non-discriminatory basis, because that's really the fundamental basis for the entire international trading system. But on the other hand, the free trade agreements actually go deeper more quickly because they reduce tariffs generally to zero on an applied basis. So while certainly I think every economist would say a global agreement on a non-discriminatory basis is the ideal, one of the reasons for the proliferation of free trade agreements is they do actually move faster and deeper among the members of those agreements. And the other reason for these agreements, I think, is that because the OMC has found it so difficult to reach agreement since the Uruguay round, it means that the trade rules that have developed within the OMC have not been revised since the mid-1990s. But world trade has changed tremendously. Already it's changed tremendously, and in the future it will change even more dramatically because of the digital revolution and the rise of digital trade. And because of the paralysis, if you like, of the OMC negotiating process, the OMC has not been able to modify its rules to keep up with the realities of international trade as it's developed. And one of the things which these preferential agreements do, and we saw evidence of that, I think, in the first presentation, looking at some of the initiatives in the Pacific Alliance, what these preferential agreements do is to, besides reducing trade barriers, they also address many of the issues that need to be addressed to facilitate modern international trade, which are not simply matters of tariffs or quotas or the traditional business of international trade. So I think that's one answer, but I think it is tragic that we have seen this paralysis in the OMC negotiating process, and that was really evident again at the Buenos Aires Ministerial in December last year, where there was simply no way that the member countries could get beyond the opposition to progress from a small number of blockers, if you like to call them that. And it was interesting at that meeting that there were a number of responses to that. One was that what is lacking in the OMC is a forum for dialogue among the members. The members are always going to the OMC in an adversarial mode, ready to negotiate agreements, but that can be actually a hindrance to reaching an agreement, because sometimes you need more dialogue before you start the negotiations, and there is no provision for that in the OMC process. And when we hear that kind of talk, some of us would say, well, actually, that's exactly what APEC is there for, is in the Asia-Pacific region, to provide a forum for dialogue where countries can come together and discuss, reach consensus, exchange ideas, without in any way compromising their negotiating positions in any agreement. And the suggestion was being made at Buenos Aires that the WTO needs some mechanism like that. That was one response. A second response was to say, well, if we can't reach agreement at the level of the OMC, maybe we can form plurilateral groups among the OMC members, so-called coalitions of the willing, to see whether some agreement on new trade rules could be produced within these plurilateral groups and maybe implemented, and then maybe later transferred to the full OMC membership by making them MFN, Most Favoured Nation. And that was the basis on which the International Technology Agreement was developed, and also the Trade Facilitation Agreement, this idea of having a critical mass approach to reaching agreements within the OMC, which can later be offered to the entire OMC membership. And the third comment that was being made was that if the OMC cannot make progress in developing new multilateral rules for today's international trade and trade system, maybe we need to look to some of these mega regional agreements like the CPTPP or the RCEP, or maybe sometime in the future the Europe-US proposed agreement, if that can be revitalised. Maybe they can develop rules which may be seen around the rest of the trading system as workable, as contributing to the improved functioning of trade, and maybe they would eventually make their way into the level of international rules. So that was kind of what I was hearing at the Buenos Aires ministerial meeting. I don't know whether that's answering your questions, Manfred.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Let me read you another question from the public. What could happen with Mexico and Canada if NAFTA negotiation ends badly?
Well, that's a big question. I would say that Mexico and Canada's objective is to do pretty much what the Koreans did, which is to make concessions to the United States, which can be presented within the United States as a huge victory, but which will result in minimum economic damage to Mexico and Canada. I think that's pretty clearly their strategy. Whether they will get away with that is really not clear. I mean, there are some poison pills, I think, is often called in the US position, the idea that there should be a sunset clause on NAFTA, that at the end of 6 years it should terminate if there is not any explicit agreement to continue it. I mean, that's very, very difficult, I think, for business and the agricultural sector to accept, because it means you can't plan long term. And there are issues that yet to be resolved on intellectual property, the rules of origin for autos. And there is always the threat from the Trump administration that they will simply withdraw from the agreement, terminate it. And there has been the suggestion that maybe one of their strategies will be to, if there is an agreement reached on the new NAFTA 2.0, would be to present that agreement to the Congress, US Congress, at the same time as giving notice to withdraw from the existing NAFTA, with the idea of putting pressure on the Congress to approve it, when there are certainly doubts as to whether Congress would be otherwise willing to approve the renegotiated NAFTA, whatever its form. Whatever its form, there will be some elements in the Congress who will oppose it. So I don't think I've answered your question, but I would say that from Mexico and Canada's perspective, a collapse of NAFTA would certainly be an enormous disruption, economic disruption, particularly for Mexico, because there's been a large build-up of economic activity centred around the value chains which link Mexico, the United States and Canada, and whether those value chains could continue without a NAFTA agreement, I think, is very, very doubtful. And so there would be, I think, a large amount of economic disruption in Mexico. Canada, possibly not so much, but also I think Canada would not come out of that very well at all. But I think the other part of the question that wasn't asked is, what about the United States? The United States would also lose a lot by the collapse of NAFTA, because NAFTA is actually, despite what President Trump says, all of the economic analysis says that NAFTA has been very beneficial to the United States. Maybe it has been damaging to some individual communities within the United States, and that was the issue I think that the first speaker highlighted, that trade benefits the country as a whole, but there are always some communities that do not share in those benefits, and that's true in the United States. But NAFTA overall is a very, very beneficial agreement to the United States. And that's why I think the mistaken logic behind the Trump administration's trade policy is so dangerous, because it leads them to try to present NAFTA as something damaging to the United States, so that they could present the collapse of NAFTA as some kind of victory for the United States, whereas actually I think it would be a minor disaster for the United States.